Thank you, Madam Speaker. We really see a side proposition that's taken on the burden to tell you that a utopia is good. We think that's an extremely low burden to take, especially in the final. So where since side proposition can set burdens for themselves, we're going to give them to them. So side proposition hasn't really seen the necessity of having a definite government. We think that when they told us that whatever government is best for the country, there's three problems with that. Firstly, many people have different views on what the best form of government is in like a country, right? But secondly, how is the UN going to pick what's the best form of government for a country? We haven't seen any criteria by side proposition on what type of government and what type of factors they're going to be looking for. But thirdly, we're going to tell you that people want democracy in the Arab world. But just to make this debate not over right now, let's just say that side proposition has to fight for authoritarian regimes. So really what they came up and told us was that, firstly, instability is really bad. We can't disagree with that. Instability is bad. But how exactly do we get stability, right? Side proposition's given you facts about stability, but all they're really cornering around is fake stability. Stability that isn't long-term. And that's what democracy brings. We take a look at places like Ghana, where Ghana had free elections, has begun to actually have a high voter turnout, and has been able to make themselves on a path for long-term success. That's the type of stability we want inside opposition, not fake stability through authoritarian regimes using propaganda or hiding facts about their own government to the people. We want a democracy that is transparent to the people and is for the people. But moreover, they talked to you about this whole point about the benefits of stability. Again, we're not going to disagree with that, but they brought up Russia, right? We think Russia was a pretty bad example to bring up in terms of a stable country, into where you see, firstly, homosexual rights not even being appreciated, but secondly, in the news, how many times have you seen violence break out in places in Russia, right? We tell you under their definition of stability, Russia does not come under that. So next up, what they talked about, actually wait, they didn't really talk about anything else. Alright, so what are we going to be talking about, right? 76% in Tunisia, 64% in Egypt, 67% in Bahrain, 83% in Somalia, 66% in the Arab world. Madam Speaker, the Arab world wants change. They want their right to free speech, they want their right to the freedom of mobility, the freedom of expression, the freedom of choice, and most importantly, the freedom to democracy. We think that if the Arab world wants democracy, we on side opposition are in no position to deny them this right. We say if they want democracy, let them have it, which is why we come to you on side opposition with the case line, where you don't have the ballot, you have the bullet. I know, it's a bit cheesy. But two burdens. Firstly, democracies, I'll take you in a second, weak or strong, are fundamentally stable and are the best form of government for the Arab world. We tell you that democracies by nature have elections, they have a constitution, and inherently have representation for their people. Wouldn't you agree?
Sir, wouldn't you say that when you suggest that the Egyptian people wanted democracy, would you suggest that democracy actually worked in that situation, that this country itself was ready for democracy, even though the people wanted it?
Right, okay, so I tell you though that the Arab Spring had flaws for sure, but there were a lot of positives that came out of that. Arjun's going to be delving more into that later on. The second burden we have to show you is even if these democracies weren't stable, they're able to exist in periods of instability, and their fundamental values are a necessity to achieving prosperity in the Arab world on a short and long-term scale. We have to lay the foundations now. Three arguments for you. Firstly, autocracies are atrocious. Secondly, democracies are desirable. And thirdly, the moral mentality, pardon my alliteration. Firstly, autocracies are atrocious. We have 3 points to this. Firstly, citizens have no say in societal affairs. What does that lead to in an autocracy? It leads to an abuse of power. It leads to a government that has too much power over their own citizens. And what that really leads to is citizens being denied their fundamental rights to speak out, their fundamental rights to contest, and their fundamental rights to express their interest. Human beings become no better than simply sheep being herded. Human beings become shackled in chains by their own government. What does that lead to? It leads to extremism, the rise to violence, the Arab world countries becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. We're fundamentally against that. But secondly, we think that in autocracies, there's internal corruption, which forms a kleptocracy. The Corruption Perception Index shows that at average, authoritarian regimes rank higher than democracies. Why? 3 reasons. Firstly, autocracies establish a patron-client network, whereas when a leader gets to power, who are they most likely to help? They're going to be helping their friends. They're going to be helping their allies. We don't think this is a meritocratic society. The government doesn't reward hard work, which is morally wrong, but more importantly, we think that economic services are filled by substandard people, individuals who receive their position because of their allies and not their abilities. That's practically wrong. Secondly, we think you have no elections, you have no checks or balances, there's no oversight, which means that leaders can take money from state-run industries and put it right into their own pocket. We've seen that in Egypt with Hosni Mubarak. And thirdly, you have no state judiciaries. Oh, I didn't hear you, sorry, go ahead.
But sir, wouldn't you say that in a democracy such as the US, would you consider George W. Bush a very able and adept leader?
Right, but I tell you it's awesome when we can actually have the power to not elect people like George W. Bush again, right? We tell you when you have a government and you have people who can actually have some sort of safety valve in politics, like if they don't like a government, they don't have to vote for that government again, right? That's a fundamental principle in democracy. But you have no state judiciaries or institutions in authoritarian regimes. There's not just an economic sector that's corrupted, but a judicial sector that's corrupted. We already talked to you about Saudi Arabia, so we don't really think we need to talk about that anymore. Autocracies aren't stable in the long term. We think that's true if we're looking at history. Now let's get to the second argument, which is probably the most important argument. Democracies are desirable. We have 4 parts to this. Firstly, contestation is natural in democracies. This leads to better ideas. But what more? A government's accountable to their own people, and I talked about there's a safety valve in politics. If a government does a poor job, unlike side proposition, the people don't have to go and start a rebellion and fight. They just don't vote for the government the next time, right? We think that's beneficial on side opposition. But thirdly, that governments have to appeal to a larger majority, right? Thus, they have to have moderate views. They have to make utilitarian decisions that account for minorities as well. Most Arab nations would tell you are ethnically fragmented. We want to solve that tension. I'll get into that later. But finally, we think it's morally correct, right? The symbol that a government gives a vote to a person, essentially a government saying, I trust you. I trust what you have to say. I trust that you have beliefs about where this country should be going and what policies this country should adopt. We think that's empowering. But what is the root of violence right now in the Arab world? Which is probably the biggest problem in the Arab world. Religion. So let's take a look at comparative analysis on which government actually does a better job in solving religion. You have an authoritarian regime, where the leader's religious views are the country's views. Funding and preference are given to one religious entity, the one that the leader follows. And thirdly, minorities aren't even present in discussions, which intensifies religious divides and social tension, something we're against. And then you have a democracy that can't give preference to one religious entity to get re-elected, or even get elected into the first place. That might need to form a coalition, thus unifying the nation. And thirdly, having to have moderate views that are established by the government. Madam Speaker, we think at the end of the day, we're laying the foundations for progress. We're laying the foundation for stability. And finally, we're laying the foundations for democracy. For all those reasons, we beg to oppose. Thank you.